She never made it to work. Her car sat untouched in the driveway. Inside her home, no signs of forced entry. Only a blood-soaked mattress, a missing daughter, and a question that still haunts investigators decades later. How does a killer erase a life without leaving a body behind? It was not the absence of Laura Houghteling that first disturbed those who entered her home, but the presence of something far more chilling. Every object in the house remained untouched. Her car sat quietly in the driveway, windows were locked, doors were bolted from the inside. Yet the silence inside the house seemed unnatural, heavy, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When Warren Houghteling stepped into his sister's bedroom, what he saw was not disorder, but an eerie, manufactured calm. The bed was made. The nightstand remained neatly arranged, but to a trained eye it was obvious that something vital was missing. The bottom sheet and the mattress pad had been stripped away. The mattress itself appeared slightly damp, carrying a faint chemical smell poorly masked by the scent of air freshener. It was the kind of scene that suggested not chaos, but a deliberate attempt to erase an unspeakable event. Investigators arriving later would uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface. When luminol was sprayed across the bare mattress and the surrounding carpet, a sickly blue glow erupted under ultraviolet light. Blood, invisible to the naked eye, told a story that no amount of cleaning could conceal. The patterns revealed that someone had been immobilized on the bed, likely struggling against restraints, before being dragged violently onto the floor. On the hardwood, faint traces of blood continued into the hallway, disappearing near the front door. But no body, no visible struggle, no shattered furniture. Everything had been meticulously controlled. Whoever had committed this act had the composure to clean, to conceal, to make the unnatural seem mundane. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a simple missing person case. Yet, the forensic evidence pointed to an unmistakable truth. Laura Houghteling was no longer alive. The volume of blood, the saturation of the mattress, the trail leading toward the exit, all indicated fatal injuries. Investigators knew from experience that the human body can only lose a fraction of its blood volume before death becomes inevitable. Here, it was clear that threshold had been crossed. Adding to the unease was a single, almost overlooked detail. A pillowcase, partially hidden under the bed, bore a dense, reddish-brown stain. Later, laboratory tests confirmed it was Laura's blood. But even more disturbing was the partial fingerprint embedded within the blood pattern, a detail invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable once magnified. It was the first tangible connection to a living suspect. In cases like this, the absence of a body does not absolve suspicion. Instead, it sharpens it. Killers who remove bodies often do so for control over the narrative, over the investigation, over the memory of their victims. Removing the body removes the proof of suffering, the evidence of identity. It renders the victim faceless, nameless, just another ghost in a case file. And such a level of post-crime manipulation is not impulsive. It is deliberate, methodical, and deeply disturbing. Laura's disappearance was not the result of a random encounter. It was the product of planning. Someone had intimate knowledge of the house, understood the rhythms of the family, and exploited a moment of vulnerability. Someone who could move freely without attracting attention, who knew which doors creaked, which locks stuck, and, when Penny Houghteling, Laura's mother, would be away on business. The profile that emerged was not of a frenzied intruder, but of a predator hiding in plain sight. Someone familiar, trusted, and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. By the time law enforcement expanded their search to the wooded areas surrounding Bethesda, hope was already fading. The forensic trail, though damning, was incomplete without a body. And every hour that passed gave the perpetrator more time to vanish, more time to erase, more time to turn Laura Houghteling from a daughter, a friend, a vibrant young woman, into nothing more than a haunting absence. This was not just a crime, it was an erasure, and it was only the beginning. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. The investigation soon turned its focus inward, narrowing from a wide field of possibilities to a chillingly close circle of trust. In the early days of 1992, Penny Houghteling had hired a man named Hadden Clark to tend the family garden. To neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, a quiet drifter, polite, willing to work, eager for approval. To Penny, he seemed almost pitiful, a man without family, without direction, worthy of small acts of kindness. Clark had been given access to the Houghteling home. He had a key to the utility room. He knew the layout of the house, the schedules of its occupants. He knew when Laura would be alone. Yet what Penny and her family could not have known was that Clark was not merely a man struggling with homelessness. He was a man with a fractured mind and a history of violence that had gone largely unnoticed. Years earlier, Clark had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His adult life had been a grim procession of arrests for petty theft, harassment, and increasingly bizarre behavior. In one incident, he was caught stealing women's clothing from a church, dressed himself in a wig and skirt, and blended into the crowd unnoticed. For Clark, these acts were not random. They were rehearsals, small performances of a deeper, more sinister fantasy. When questioned by detectives about Laura's disappearance, Clark's demeanor shifted erratically. At first, he appeared cooperative, almost eager to assist. But as the conversation deepened, he collapsed onto the floor, clutching his head, moaning that he just wanted to die. It was a performance, but a transparent one. The investigators recognized the tactic immediately, a desperate bid to manipulate sympathy and derail the line of questioning. A search of Clark's battered pickup truck revealed the first tangible pieces of his secret life. Among the debris of his mobile existence, officers found a length of nylon rope, duct tape, a wig, a pillowcase stained with faint brown smears, and a meticulously kept ledger of every minor purchase he had made over the preceding weeks. One entry stood out starkly. 3 days before Laura disappeared, Clark had purchased rope, duct tape, and utility knives. Next to the purchase, in the margin, he had scrawled a single name: Laura. Further investigation led authorities to a storage unit Clark had rented in Warwick, Rhode Island, over 400 miles from Bethesda. What they uncovered inside was more disturbing than any could have predicted. The unit was filled with women's clothing, shoes, wigs, makeup, and purses, each carefully arranged, catalogued almost lovingly. It was not the collection of a thief. It was a wardrobe, curated with precision, meant for someone who wished not to own these items, but to become them. Among the items was a synthetic blonde wig. Forensic comparison would later reveal that synthetic fibers found on Laura's bed matched this wig exactly. Clark's fantasy life had long since eclipsed reality. He was no longer content to steal symbols of femininity. He needed to inhabit them, to erase the barriers between his own broken identity and those he envied. Laura Houghteling had not simply been a victim of opportunity. She had been chosen because she represented everything Clark could never be: youthful, vibrant, loved, and complete. The forensic evidence converged steadily. A partial fingerprint, lifted from a blood-stained pillowcase found in Laura's room, was positively identified as Clark's. The synthetic fibers connected him to the scene. The items in his truck and storage unit formed a mosaic of obsession that could no longer be dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Yet, even as the physical evidence stacked higher, the psychological profile emerging from the shadows was more unsettling still. Clark was not motivated by anger, nor by financial gain, nor even by simple sexual violence. His crime was one of transformation, an attempt to annihilate the object of his longing and absorb her essence. When killers erase their victims' identities, they often do so to avoid capture, to strip away connections to the living world. But for Clark, it went deeper. He did not merely wish to destroy Laura Houghteling, he wanted to become her. This pathology, the desire to inhabit the life of another so completely that murder becomes a gateway, is rare, but not unheard of among the most dangerous of offenders. It requires a chilling combination of narcissism, dissociation, and a profound loss of personal identity. As the case against Hadden Clark solidified, it became clear that the disappearance of Laura Houghteling was not the end of his story. It was, in fact, only a glimpse into the far darker abyss that lay beneath his unassuming exterior, one that would soon reveal a trail of pain stretching back years, and perhaps even further. The monster had been hiding in plain sight, rehearsing his fantasy life with every stolen garment, every falsified smile, every act of quiet deceit. And when the time came, he crossed the line between fantasy and reality without hesitation, without remorse. In the end, Hadden Clark was not just a killer. He was an eraser of lives, a man for whom the boundary between self and victim no longer existed. And his thirst for erasure was far from over. As Hadden Clark sat in custody, the initial sense of closure surrounding Laura Houghtelin's murder began to unravel. Clark remained largely silent, offering no confession, no remorse. Yet something deeper and more disturbing lingered beneath his detached demeanor. Experienced investigators knew that silence itself could be a form of confession, a refusal to acknowledge humanity, either in oneself or in one's victims. The breakthrough did not come from an interrogation room, but from within the claustrophobic walls of a prison cell. Clark had been assigned a new cellmate, Jack Truitt, a man already convicted of murder himself. Over restless nights and whispered conversations, Truitt realized that Clark was not merely guilty of a single crime. He was a man carrying the weight of far more deaths than anyone had dared to imagine. Truitt, seeking leverage for his own sentence, encouraged Clark to talk, not by asking questions, but by handing him paper, scraps of napkins, anything that could capture the fragments of confession. Clark seemed desperate yet afraid to speak aloud. Slowly, almost methodically, Clark began to draw. Primitive sketches, scenes of violence, images of children, women, and graves unmarked by any stone or cross. Among these scattered confessions emerged the name Michelle Dorr, a 6-year-old girl who had disappeared without a trace in 1986 near Silver Spring, Maryland. The connection was immediate and chilling. Clark had lived near the Dorr family at the time. He had been questioned during the initial investigation, but with no evidence, no witnesses, and an apparent alibi, he had been allowed to slip away. Now, in grim, broken sentences, Clark admitted what had long been feared. He had lured Michelle into the house under false pretenses. He had silenced her before she could scream, and then, as if describing the act of discarding an old toy, he had hidden her body in a duffel bag, buried it among the roots of a forest long since reclaimed by time and indifference. Even this admission, horrifying as it was, did not fully prepare investigators for what came next. Clark spoke of eating parts of Michelle's flesh, a detail so grotesque that it bordered on the incomprehensible. Yet it fit the emerging profile. A man so dissociated from his own humanity that consumption became another act of domination, another means to obliterate the boundary between himself and his victim. Guided by Clark's fragmented recollections, authorities eventually unearthed the skeletal remains of Michelle Dorr. The discovery confirmed what Clark had whispered in the darkness, that his crimes were not isolated incidents of rage or opportunity, but carefully cultivated rituals of annihilation. And still, the horror deepened. Acting on further information, detectives secured a search warrant for a small piece of property once owned by Clark's grandfather. It was there, buried beneath the soil, that they found a plastic bucket containing nearly 200 pieces of women's jewelry. Rings, necklaces, earrings, each corroded by time but still clinging to traces of the lives they once adorned. Some pieces were linked to Laura Houghteling. Others remained unidentified, silent witnesses to crimes that had never been solved, perhaps never even reported. Each trinket was a trophy, a totem of conquest, collected not for monetary value but for remembrance, for control, for the maintenance of an identity that only existed through the destruction of others. When asked why he had kept these items, Clark offered no direct answer, but the implication was clear. In his mind, the women to whom these pieces belonged had not truly disappeared. They had been absorbed, catalogued, and preserved within the labyrinth of his fractured psyche. Authorities began cross-referencing missing persons reports across state lines, focusing on cases involving young women and girls who bore similarities to Laura and Michelle. Patterns emerged, faint but undeniable. Sightings of a man fitting Clark's description near the time of disappearances, anonymous tips about a suspicious drifter, storage units rented under aliases, trails that led nowhere, or to graves yet undiscovered. Clark himself, when pressed, would sometimes lapse into cryptic statements. He would mention other names, other places, Cape Cod, upstate New York, Virginia. But he offered no precise locations, no dates, no certainty. Whether this was intentional cruelty, the result of delusion, or the natural decay of a mind unhinged by decades of predation, no one could say for sure. What became evident was this: Hadden Clark was not a killer who had been caught early in his spree. He was a remnant of a much longer, much darker history. A predator who had mastered the art of disappearance, not his own, but that of others. He did not merely take lives, he unmade them. In the years that followed, law enforcement agencies would continue to investigate Clark's possible connections to other unsolved cases. Some families would find closure. Others would be left with only the agonizing knowledge that someone, somewhere, had worn the jewelry of their lost loved one. And Hadden Clark, sentenced to decades behind bars, would remain a figure of quiet, smirking menace. A man whose crimes were so methodical, so devoid of recognizable motive, that they defied easy explanation. He was not merely a killer, he was a collector of absence, a curator of ghosts. And long after the cell doors closed behind him, the echoes of the lives he erased would continue to haunt the spaces he left behind.